Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Greer Meisels, and I am the Chief of Staff here at the IIF. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session titled, The Industry Takes the Initiative. Before we begin our session, a few quick housekeeping rules. First of all, if you're unable to join us for one of the sessions today, fear not. Everything will be available later on the IIF website. Also, as Sonia noted earlier, you can send questions to the moderator for each panel discussion through the Q&A prompt that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible given the short amount of time that we have. After all, in this virtual format, this will be the way to make this session as engaging as possible. Also, if you're joining us as a participant, you can obviously see us, the panelists. However, we cannot see you, the participants, and participants cannot see one another, which after all this time joining virtual calls, that might come as a relief to some of you. But also please note that if attendees are joining via phone, you will only be able to listen to the webinar and will not be able to submit questions. Finally, one last reminder before we begin, this session is on the record and the audience could include press. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, it is really my distinct pleasure to introduce you to this panel of distinguished guests. With us today, I have Matt Arnold, who is the head of ESG and corporate responsibility engagement at JP Morgan. We have Judson Berkey, who is the head of sustainability regulatory strategy at UBS. Patricia Hudson, the head of executive communications and thought leadership at State Street. And Barbara Novick, who is the vice chairman and co-founder of BlackRock. Thank you so much for joining us all today. So 2019 was a huge year for ESG and for sustainable finance. There was a shift from awareness towards action, product development, significant efforts to build in-house capacity to assess climate and ESG risks. And that was particularly strong among financial institutions. There was a huge demand for ESG data. The size of the ESG data market surpassed $600 billion in 2019, which was up from $300 billion in 2016. Immediately before this, we heard from Frank Elderson, who is the head of the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, which saw a number of new banks and regulatory agencies join as members. And just last year, almost a year ago today, during the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, the IFC launched its operating principles for impact management. This was certainly a step forward to the sustainable and impact investing front. And of course, 2020 also started off really, really strong. In January 2020, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink noted in his annual letter that BlackRock would begin to exit certain investments that present a high sustainability-related risk, and that the evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance. More financial institutions joined Climate Action 100+, which we may touch on a little bit later. And in March 2020, of course, the EU issued the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, which we may also discuss later. And of course, next week is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So we really started off with a bang. However, many fear that the COVID-19 pandemic will mean a step back for sustainable finance, as quick and often carbon-intensive fixes are sought to galvanize the economic recovery. So I suppose to start off the discussion with all of you, I would ask you, how you're thinking about this. And are you worried about the future of the sustainable finance agenda? Whoever would like to kick it off, please feel free.
Hey, Greer, it's Patricia here from State Street. First of all, thanks so much for having us all today. I think we probably would all agree, and I think we heard it from the previous speaker, that obviously we're all focused now on this terrible pandemic and the economic fallout resulting from it. And so to that extent, I think it's probably a little too early to say what the ultimate impact of the virus is going to be on the sustainable finance agenda. But obviously, we've already heard from EU officials like Ursula von der Leyen that, in fact, the economic recovery for Europe will be pinned to their sustainable finance goals. But having said that, I think, we are seeing some of the parallels between the response to the pandemic and what a lot of experts have been saying will be required for really addressing the climate challenge, whether it's sort of global coordination and really taking action on these long-term challenges that have a material impact on, well, in our case, our clients' portfolios. So too soon to tell, but I think we see a path toward maintaining the sustainable finance agenda. And certainly, I know we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the data issues around that agenda. That work is certainly continuing at State Street.
Greer, I would add to that, when we talk about sustainable finance, we really have to think more broadly about all of the ESG issues. And right now, given the COVID crisis and the issues around that, some of the issues that might normally be considered quote unquote social issues, like human capital management, come to the fore. Likewise, some of the governance issues in terms of business continuity management and long-term strategy. So I think we have to think about sustainable finance with all of its components, the objective being long-term viable, sustainable business models, and not narrowly just looking at one element of that.
Right. That was going to be one of my questions was, a lot of times when we think about ESG, it seems as if the emphasis has been on the E part and maybe to a lesser extent G. But, as things are changing given the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems like what we consider S is becoming increasingly important. And I guess, Barbara, maybe staying with you for a moment, do you think, the COVID-19 will impact investors' appetite for sustainable investments? And do you see opportunities for kind of, investment innovation to mitigate and weather this crisis a bit more?
So I'm going to be the person that brings good news.
Good.
A world of a lot of bad news. But, one of the things that we've seen in this last quarter is how ESG impacts companies. And when you look at various indices, I'll give you just some data points from other people. Bloomberg put out a piece, talked about 59% of U.S. ESG ETFs outperforming the S&P 500 and 60% of European ESG ETFs outperforming the MSCI Europe. Likewise, Morningstar put out a different report saying 24 out of 26 ESG tilted indices did better than their non-ESG equivalents. So you start seeing the data that supports the argument for ESG. Now, in fairness, some of this is driven in the short term by energy stocks, and energy obviously doing very poorly. But I think there's also a lot more behind that. In addition, we're seeing the customer demand. And I think this is, in your prior panel, you asked, how does finance fit in? And we've said for a long time that we have to do things that our clients want. It seems kind of obvious, but what has happened is we've been able over time to help in educating clients about the importance of these as investment factors. And in fact, in the first quarter, what we saw were inflows to sustainable products, including ETFs and index funds. The demand is very strong. When I look year over year, we have today 91 sustainable ETFs with $30 billion of assets under management. A lot of people immediately assume, oh, that's Europe. But I took a breakdown. 13 billion is Europe. 16 billion is US, which I think surprises people. and then the rest spread over Canada and Latin America and Asia Pacific, where these ideas have just started to gain acceptance. So I actually will say I'm encouraged from an investment perspective that you are going to see more money allocated to companies that are prioritizing, I'll say, sustainability broadly, not just narrowly.
That's great. That is a little bit of good news. We don't actually get enough of that these days. Judson, switching to for a moment, maybe at even a more fundamental level, is it clear what actually is a sustainable investment? I think many around this virtual room and maybe around the virtual audience would agree that we're pretty far from finding common ground around taxonomy and sustainable investment terms. How are you thinking about that? How is UBS thinking about that?
Thanks for the question. There's certainly different numbers you can look to in terms of the size of the sustainable finance market. Some people point to a 30 trillion number that comes from a biennial survey done by the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. There's at some level 90 trillion of signatories for the Principles for Responsible Investment. I guess one of the things that I think the industry is still trying to come to terms with a little bit is around terminology and what we call products, which products are sustainable, what makes them sustainable. Certainly the EU's put forward the taxonomy as one way to try and guide this whole discussion, and in a very granular way, they essentially set the rules for what should count. Within our own work within the IEF, we've been looking at terminology and whether we can somehow come up with some grouping mechanisms. I think it was interesting that at the same time we put out a paper last year, in the UK, the Investment Association put out a very similar sort of paper, and so I think there's a sign there that are trying to come together to think about how we can better articulate the kinds of products we offer, so that our clients really can understand them better and more easily, and essentially find the kind of products that they're looking for. So to Barbara's point, to try and support that continued growth and the good performance we're seeing in the products. I think one of the things we really need to work on as an industry is to try and come to some better definitions around how we describe some of what we do.
Right. A question just came in that fits nicely into the discussion. And somebody asks, is there going to be enough offer to meet that growing demand for green sustainable assets? And Matt, I think you've talked about this before, the whole issue of a pipeline, and that there is funding out there, but you need the pipeline in order to figure out where to channel those funds. How are you seeing that?
Thanks, Greer. I guess I see it as there's a lot of liquidity available even now in this tight time, and my sense is that the public capital markets are ready to finance the pipeline of sustainable projects that come in. Energy is probably absorbing the most capital, but I don't see, even now in the last month, I don't see a capital shortage. My view is it's a bit of a pipeline constraint. In other words, if the project is creditworthy and ready to go, I think it gets financed. I'm on a board of a couple of companies, and that's holding true for us.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in on that? I mean, I guess, one follow-on question, maybe Matt, for you as well, is, how do you see COVID-19 really affecting SDG funding initiatives? How are you seeing that? How is JP Morgan seeing that?
So that's something we're thinking about every day, because we have, as you may know, a commitment to fund the SDGs. We committed to $200 billion in 2020. Our early first quarter results look strong. We think it's a little too early to tell. We're making no changes. We have teams in place around development finance, around green finance. I think when we mapped it out, we're tapping into a dozen or so of the SDGs. I do think that the small business market is going to have a longer term impact. And if the small business market doesn't sort of get back on its feet, that's going to be a really tough challenge. But I would say for now, no change at all. We stay on course.
Right. Okay. Here at the IIF, we have developed Barbara, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to add, similar to what I said earlier on client demand, you see interest in things like renewable power and, which is basically wind and solar. And while we don't have something like that in an ETF or a mutual fund, it doesn't really lend itself given the illiquidity and long-term aspect of the asset. We do have a whole series of private funds, and we were in the market recently and, raised, over $5 billion. So, I think it comes back to how are investors building their portfolios and what things do they want to see in that portfolio. And then I think there are projects, and we've been able to invest quite a bit of money in that sector over the last 5-10 years. And I would expect that, the opportunities will be there and the funding is now available as well.
Right. Patricia, at the beginning, when you were talking about the issue of data, and you said that, we would probably touch on that some. At the IIF, we've been thinking about a sort of sustainable finance pyramid that sets out the framework of building blocks for the assessment of climate-related risks and opportunities. And it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you or anybody else on this panel that data is at its foundation. And data gaps are a big issue in any area of risk management, but climate and broader ESG data can be particularly problematic because ESG data is often incomparable, incomplete, or missing altogether. How big a challenge is this, and how is State Street looking at this?
Yeah, Greer, it's sort of foundational, I think, to making real progress on incorporating sustainability into long-term investments. And I think you're probably aware that both State Street and BlackRock have endorsed the SASB materiality framework as well as the TCFD principles because they're both investor led frameworks that really focus on the value drivers that are important for investors. But there really is an issue with the data disarray, and we are really so happy that the IIF is sponsoring various workshops on the specific issues around climate data. And we've got an upcoming workshop that we're co-hosting with the IIF in September, where we really want to bring together a critical mass of asset managers to agree on, when it comes to climate data, these are the metrics that are important to us. These are the methodologies we want companies to use to calculate those metrics. And this is how we want them to be reporting on them. Because at the moment, the challenge is that there really isn't a lot of consistency and comparability to the data. And we have to quickly get to that stage so that managers are asking company to be reporting on the same things, and that those results can be audited. That's a sort of key issue to making progress. And I just wanted to come back to some of the issues around supply and demand for these sustainable investments. I think, at State Street, similar to a lot of the other institutional clients that my fellow panelists work with, I think there is this recognition, because they tend to be large, long-term investors, that they do have to get their heads around these sustainability issues that will impact the long-term value of their portfolio holdings. So I think it's really a much broader conversation around how to integrate these sustainability risks across their entire investment programs. And I think in a lot of cases, again, with some of the larger investors, that is an investment consideration, an investment risk that they are taking seriously. And I don't think, even in this current crisis situation with the pandemic, that that's going to change. I think, as Barbara said, the evidence is pretty compelling that these sustainability issues do impact the long-term value of an investment portfolio.
And Greer, I would add here as well, I don't think people fully understand the problem from issuers' perspective on data. So, investors say, look, we support SASB and TCFD, but Yafit Cohen of Travelers was hired to work on their disclosure. And her first thing she did was an assessment, and she testified at the Investment Advisory Committee for the SEC and said Travelers was getting 50 plus surveys and data verification requests a year. And she had to figure out, they didn't have the resources to put proper attention to all of them. She had to figure out which ones are actually important to their investor base. And so, she went through a whole process of meeting with investors and whatnot, and narrowed it down to a much, much shorter list. And was interesting in that what she found was the investors in the company cared about SASB and TCFD. And a lot of these other data requests, while they have different importance and impacts and affect ratings and indices and lots of things, at the end of the day, they kind of skinnied down the list pretty dramatically. And I bring that up because this proliferation of surveys leads to pretty low quality data. And if somebody is putting something out and they're putting all their effort in, a few, the quality, we believe, goes up. And the consistency of that data also goes up. So you can now do apples to apples comparisons. And even though different sectors may have different issues, and SASB recognizes that, which we like, the idea that everybody's reporting something totally different, or just sort of filling out surveys quickly, that doesn't really do it from a quality perspective. And I think that issuer piece needs to be better understood. And the more people can coalesce behind what they really want, the more likely the issuers will embrace that as well, if they can only do a few rather than dozens of them.
Right. Maybe a quick follow-on question to that that we received from the audience. There's a question on the EU Commission consultation on renewed strategy. They're seeking feedback on regulation and standardization of ESG data providers. Do any of the panelists have views on kind of standardization of data through policy frameworks?
I think there is some potential there. Actually, there was a paper that came out from IOSCO just this week, where they have done, it appears, quite an extensive review of the marketplace, and to Barbara's point, some of the tens, if not almost 100 of the different disclosure requirements that exist, and they've essentially come to the conclusion that there may well be value and a need for further alignment, actually standard setting. They actually harken back to work that IOSCO sort of catalyzed back in the 90s and early 2000s to move towards the international accounting, the international set of accounting standards. So I think there is potential for standard setting and policy setting to help drive some of the standardization across disclosure and ultimately get us to better data. To Barbara's point, if there's only one standard, you can spend a lot more time making sure you hit that standard with high quality data than if you're having to juggle 10, 20, 30 different surveys all coming in roughly the same time, asking for roughly the same thing, but in slightly different formats and ways.
Sure.
If I could give a little plug to IIF, we look at it as there are 3 categories of standardization that are needed. One is an agreement of sort of I'll call it what's green, what's brown, what's in between. Second is, so that's sort of the activities level. Second is, what should companies be disclosing? But third is for asset managers and products that we offer, coming up with a taxonomy that people can understand what different products are. IIF worked with a group of participants on a paper late last year, and essentially, Sonia, you'll be upset, but I don't remember the names, but one category is an exclusion category, one category is an impact category, and in between are things like tilted strategies or optimized strategies. And I think if we could at least coalesce around some naming agreements for the industry, it would help for clients to find the funds they want. It would help the broker-dealers and people who are advising clients as well in building portfolios. And it would also address the question of greenwashing. Well, I might have a product that's in that in-between category, and yes, it might have some natural gas or other fossil fuel companies. That's not greenwashing. That's different than an exclusion portfolio. I think we need to get that language, if you will, more standardized so that people understand what they're looking at and what they're looking for if they want to find it. Now, unfortunately, I think from a regulatory perspective, there's very mixed views around the world. Some regulators really wanting something like that, and some very much wanting the private sector to step up and come up with something that works for investors and end investors as well. So there are a number of initiatives going on right now, and Judd, your firm and ours are certainly involved in that. And I think if we can get to a spot where there is this uniformity of the product taxonomy, that will also help this discussion.
Thanks. Switching gears just slightly, we have a question that came in that asked about how will sustainable finance flows be redirected as a result of this crisis? How will post-pandemic risk be factored into ESG frameworks? I don't know if who would like to take this question. I don't know if this is something, Matt, maybe you'd like to take on, or
sure.
Or, great.
So the boring answer is we don't know, and I apologize for that. But our incoming is so high about what's going to happen, and the reality is. So let's just start with we don't know. But then you go, okay, well, we have some ideas. So we're looking at the resilience of communities, and you look at sort of cash flow available to small businesses, to families, and so I think my sense is there may be greater precision in the sustainability field around the resilience aspects of the social parts of ESG, where it's less about ethics and more about the ability of communities, disadvantaged people, to kind of weather a shock like this. How long can you go with no income? And, our research shows not very long for a lot of people. So I think what we're seeing in our world in the last month, kind of resilience around small business is really, really big and coming up. And I would think that it may sort of penetrate its way into the sustainable finance world, kind of in an SDG broader realm. Justin, you were going to say something too.
Yeah, Judson, then Patricia.
I just wanted to echo some of the things that Matt was saying, but I think we're also, even in these early days, seeing a lot of parallels being drawn between the resiliency challenges that this pandemic has created and, some of the broader resiliency and sustainability issues that we've all been talking about. So, for example, there have been a number of epidemiologists and public health experts drawing the connection between some of these new pathogens that we're seeing, like the COVID-19 virus, and connecting that with climate change and the loss of biodiversity and so on. So I sort of see these two issues coming together at a lot of different points. Again, how we respond to the pandemic, I think, will contain a lot of implications for how we address climate change risks going forward.
Right. And Judson, you also wanted to jump in.
I guess maybe just to pick up on those points and harken back a little bit to what Frank was saying in his session. I think one of the key lessons we can take from this is your nature is not going to negotiate. And so the extent that we have other topics like climate that are building up, it's going to be on someone else's timeline than what our human societies think it should be. To Dr. Fauci's statements, the virus decides. Well, the climate's going to decide for us in some cases. So to address that, to Matt's point, really need to be thinking in terms of resiliency. You can't predict when tail risks will hit, but you can certainly plan for the fact that they will hit at some point. So how to build in that resiliency, whether it's both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side, I think is going to be key. And I think sometimes we have some great lessons we can take. I think all of our firms are probably operating with 90% of our staff working from home. If you had asked us at the beginning of the year, could we do that business as usual, we would have said no. No way we could do that. But we are actually doing it. And I think to also pick up on one of Frank's points, I think we've also seen that crises concentrate the mind and can generate creativity. The programs that have been put in place and the amount of money that's been directed to small businesses is really quite impressive. Here in Switzerland, basically within a week, we had a joined up program across all the banks and the government that essentially was approving loan applications in less than an hour and has moved almost about 16 billion to 100,000 SMEs over the past few weeks. That's basically 25% of the Swiss government's budget every year, or about 3% of our GDP. So the fact that the public and private sector can come together that quickly and address an issue, I think actually makes me hopeful for things like environment and climate. Hopefully we're building some good experience and generating some muscle memory that we can use for the next challenges that come.
Barbara, did you want to say anything on this particular topic?
Yeah, I basically agree a lot with what other people have said, so we can move on.
Okay, great. There's been a couple of questions that have come in on emerging markets and developing economies. One question says, do you think that investors in the developing countries should be more concerned with engagement to raise the bar of issuers' behavior and disclosure, not just divestment to achieve lower carbon portfolios?
Well, I think I'll take a first shot at that. I think that engagement is happening. And in fact, the whole Climate Action 100 concept is to make sure that the largest companies in that, I don't know if I call it a sector, but who meet that criteria, there is engagement. And that's very different than divestiture. And I think most large investors would say it's better to stay invested and be engaged, have a seat at the table to have the conversation. And you do see improvements, some really significant, some more modest, but you do see the improvements in these companies over time. Now, one caveat I would give is one of the things we see in a lot of emerging markets is many of the companies in question have a controlling shareholder, either an outright control of a 50+% or a very large shareholder, call it 30+%. So you do have to be realistic about how much influence other shareholders have. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversations, and in fact we do, but recognize how much influence investors have versus more publicly owned in a broader sense type companies. And my guess is Patricia has a similar experience.
Patricia, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and emphasize that, State Street, like BlackRock, we basically own the market in our index strategies. And so by definition, we're sort of the nearest thing to permanent capital. So engagement is central to what we do. And although there's often this misconception that we're quote unquote passive investors, both of our companies have very active stewardship teams that are engaging with these companies around the world. And as Barbara indicated, divestment ends the conversation, and in many cases, basically just sells the company to another investor, or sells that share to another investor who isn't as interested in these issues. So I think active engagement is going to be more important than ever, particularly during this crisis period. And I think both BlackRock and State Street have continued to focus on ESG issues in our engagement with our portfolio companies, obviously with a slightly different nuance given the current crisis. But ESG is still very much front and center. But obviously, we're talking about things like the health and safety of companies' employees, how they're continuing to serve their clients, how are they safeguarding their supply chains, what are they doing to safeguard the fundamental financial resiliency of their companies. But those are very much in the context of longer-term ESG considerations. Yes, I think engagement will continue to be important for long-term investors, and these ESG issues will be very much part of that ongoing engagement.
And I know we're getting close to running up against the clock. I don't know, Matt Judson, did you have anything to add to this particular discussion? And if not, there's a question, I'm guessing it's maybe more for Matt, that was saying, somebody asked, are you suggesting that due to COVID-19, the new ESG sustainable finance might be SMEs financing, kind of a back to basics? Was that what you were implying, or something different?
Not directly. It's not so much just about SMEs, but what's really come roaring to, I think, all of us is resilience. And even the last question about engagement in emerging markets, there's been a capital flight out of emerging markets of a significant volume. So you probably have liquidity issues in a lot of emerging markets. I happen to have a son who lives in Nairobi. The ability of a lot of these communities to withstand a highly infectious, low mortality threat like COVID is very low. And so I find all of our discussions at JP Morgan, we're having, our meetings are twice a day. I'm sure all of you are meeting constantly with your teams. The sort of very near-term resilience of constituencies, whether they're employees or owners of small companies, is really up front and center. And that's going to roll up into the S&P 500 pretty soon. So I guess, and this is very personal, this is not like some official statement, I'm just personally witnessing the vulnerability of large numbers of people and small businesses. And we had north of 300,000 applications to the SBA program. So it's that aspect of it is very urgent. If we talk about sustainable finance and ignore that going forward, I don't think we'll be able to.
I hate to say this, but I think we have run up against the clock, and in fact, we've taken a couple of extra minutes. I'm sorry the session was only 40 minutes long. It would have been great to talk to you all for longer. So with that, I'll just say thank you to all the panelists. You were terrific. It was a great discussion. And for the rest of the audience, I welcome you all back here at 9:35 a.m. sharp to join my colleague Sonia Gibbs again on a panel discussion about reassessing sustainable finance policy agenda. So thank you so much, everybody.